Franklin smote the ground, and out sprang George Washington, fully grown and on his horse. Franklin then electrified him with his miraculous lightning rod, and the three of them, Franklin, Washington, and the horse, conducted the entire revolution all by themselves.
I like it.
I grew up as a kid loving the musical 1776. The epic struggle of congressmen arguing about a revolution for the independence from England, trapped in a relatively small room as the Revolutionary War raged all around them, has an intricacy that impresses. It's a stage adaptation, so the fact that 90% of it takes place in Independence Hall, with the war represented only from letters from Abigail Adams and General Washington, makes a lot of sense. But this isn't a massive epic. It's a tight battle of wits between some of the most brilliant minds in American history, contained in one clunky Congress chamber.
Where's Rhode Island?
Rhode Island is out visiting the necessary.
You'd think that Congress would have its own privy.
Under fierce heat and a great lack of rum. The movie's thesis is that the Declaration of Independence, ever being written and signed, was a miracle. Southern colonies objected to emancipation. Pennsylvania bristles at giving up British citizenship. And
New York abstains courteously.
in the middle, Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson try to legally ratify what Adams and the besieged George Washington, who's never on screen, know to be true. The Rubicon has been passed, and the fledgling country needs to justify its revolt to secure foreign support. The movie does a great job of building sympathy for the many characters. Even beyond the many congressmen and Abigail Adams, John Hancock and the long-suffering congressional secretary Charles Thompson have many moments to shine, as does their janitor, McNair.
Mr. Hancock?
What is it, Mr. McNair?
I can't say as I'm very fond of the United States of America as a name for a new country.
I don't claim to be a historical scholar in any way, but as I've grown older, some of the inconsistencies in this movie do start to annoy me. Pennsylvania's John Dickinson, one of the film's sort of villains, is portrayed as a loyalist to King George, when in fact he rejected the war because of his pacifist beliefs and concerns about foreign support for the revolution. Not really a fair way to treat somebody whose own enemies held him up as an honorable and patriotic man. Jefferson is portrayed as an effete intellectual who's passionately randy for his wife, whereas the real man was a genius, but also a very complicated and problematic individual. I feel like the musical Hamilton got Jefferson's character better.
So what did I miss?
This brings up the question of historical adaptations, and that's a huge topic. It's normal for a movie to tweak a few facts for dramatic effect. The space program film Hidden Figures took liberties with the timeline of its heroines. They make last-minute decisions literally on the gangplank before liftoff. But I'm not bothered because having a massively successful film that brings three heroes of the space program to light seems worth fudging here and there. And you've got to make films entertaining. As a smart friend of mine said, you really can't untangle art from profits. On the other hand, the recent Best Picture The Green Book was based off a memoir glamorizing its author's role, which was protested as fiction by the family of the secondary protagonist, and that sits uneasily with me. The difference, in my opinion, is what I'll call the fist pump. If your movie is aimed primarily at getting people excited about events, and those events never actually happened, I'm looking at you, Bohemian Rhapsody, you're lying to your audience. Which isn't to say that you can't fudge details and make a great work of art. Richard III and Richard II by Shakespeare are both masterpieces, despite being essentially one-sided propaganda. Probably the worst example I've ever seen of this is Braveheart, and I apologize in advance to the movie's many fans. It was a huge hit for a reason. Mel Gibson's a very talented director, but it takes liberties to make the audience fist pump that fly in the face of reality. I don't care that William Wallace's armies wouldn't actually have worn kilts. That's a stylistic choice, if a bit stereotypical. But the idea of the French princess bearing Wallace's child as he and the king died when she was a child at the time, and they may never have met, deflates the drama, as does having Edward II's lover defenestrated as a gag, when he was actually a really influential figure in European politics. And the rule about prima nocta, which wasn't actually a thing in Scotland at the time, those details are included to get the audience pumped up, and the studio expects the audience to think it's all true. Braveheart succeeds with people because it's a personal metaphor. Courage, strength, never backing down, which explains its enormous popularity. But its main thesis,
But they'll never take our freedom!
pales when hundreds of years later you have another Scottish man saying,
Some people hate the English, I don't. They're just wankers. We, on the other hand, are colonised by wankers. Can't even find a decent culture to be colonised by.
They can take your freedom. That's what tyrants do. Us viewers safe at home can get pumped up, but the vast majority of us will never have to face these consequences. So Wallace is fighting and dying in our place. There's another way to make historical films, even heavily fictionalized ones, and I think 1776 manages that. The best example of this is Lawrence of Arabia, and it's the most anti-fist pump film of all time. T.E. Lawrence, as Allenby says,
He's riding the whirlwind.
fighting a war under a delusion that there's any chance for the local people to escape colonial control. Lawrence is an extremely complex character. He's a war hero who loses control, a statesman who tries to fit square pegs into round holes. You don't leave the movie thinking, but instead thinking, this world is a complete mess, and so is Lawrence. Now, the unfortunate side was that Lawrence's family saw the film, and as his brother said, I didn't even recognize my brother at all. That's a valid complaint, which thankfully the families of William Wallace and John Adams didn't have to experience. However, Lawrence of Arabia is fiction, based heavily on Lawrence's book, The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, which many historians already say is an inaccurate description of his work during World War I. But there's a couple of tricks with Lawrence of Arabia that make it work. Now, I'm not going to go into the sheer glory of the cinematography, editing, script, and performances, which make this a favorite of mine, but instead into its place in history. First point, this movie has no qualms playing with history for cinematic effect, but it's honest about that. Three of my favorite characters, Ali, Dryden, and Brighton, are all amalgamations of officers from their respective armies. These men never actually existed. The things they say were genuinely said by various people, but to simplify, they're balled up into three characters. In some ways, these characters remind me of One Night in Miami, where Ali, Malcolm X, Sam Cooke, and Jim Brown are brought together to give broad arguments about their various views on the American government and the black experience. Or Steve Martin's play Picasso at the Lapin Agile, where Picasso, Albert Einstein, and eventually Elvis Presley trade ideas together. You're not meant to take any of it literally, you're meant to accept it as a metaphor using historical figures. Another is that the film is, for the most part, a character study. While I sympathize with Lawrence's family, who didn't like the character Peter O'Toole played, the character David Lean and Peter O'Toole came up with has a phenomenally complex personality, much of which can be seen in Seven Pillars of Wisdom. Unlike Braveheart, where William Wallace is essentially a flawless hero, the film is very critical of Lawrence's flaws, showboating, and conflicted loyalties, even while it praises him for bravery, determination, and brilliance. Seriously, just read Lawrence's translation of the Odyssey. The guy was a genius, and the movie recognizes that, but also his deep flaws. The third point I'd make is that the film works from a purely metaphorical level. Seeing the British and French carve up the Middle East into incomprehensible borders may not have happened exactly as the movie portrays it. Lawrence was certainly more aware and complicit in the post-war colonial goals, but it definitely happened, and we're still reeling from the consequences of that to this day. 1776 does similar work with Adams, who's shouted down as obnoxious and unliked regularly. And
John, why don't you give it up? Nobody listens to you. You're obnoxious and disliked.
I'm obnoxious and disliked, you know that, sir.
Yes, I know.
He's obnoxious and disliked. Did you know that? I hadn't heard.
And Franklin, who spends most of the time trying not to doze off between witticisms.
What are you staring at? Haven't you ever seen a great man before?
You're obviously meant to be rooting for the passing of the Declaration of Independence, but the guys putting it together are flawed, struggling with politics and their own misdoubts and their personal quirks. So, in defense of 1776, while you're meant to appreciate the hard work and determination that went into getting the Declaration signed, there's not a lot of fist pumping, mostly just a resignation that it's hard to get 13 clocks to chime at the same time, which, if anything, gives me a little sympathy for our current impasses in Congress. It's not a perfect film, or an entirely factual one, but as a description of what it takes to found a country, my country, it is pretty great.